My name is Ruth Gledhill and I'm Assistant Editor of The Tablet. And with me today is Aili Winstanley Channer, who is our Plato Trust intern at The Tablet. And we're extremely honoured to be interviewing Father Richard Moth, the new Archbishop of Westminster.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for agreeing to see us.
Thank you for coming along.
And we're here at Archbishop's House in Westminster. And have you been here long? Have you settled in?
I'm still unpacking books, but we're getting there.
So Aili is going to kick off with our first question.
So what kind of leadership do you feel that the church needs at this point in history?
There's a word I always put with leadership, which is the word service. And I think we need a leadership of service. I think in many respects we do have a leadership of service. I think we've seen it in Pope Francis, other popes before him. We see it I believe, in Pope Leo. So it's that model of leadership, which is a model that is of service.
Yes. And in the world at the moment, we're living in rather unstable times, both in terms of national and international politics. And do you think that the church has a role to play in providing a moral voice in that context? And what issues should she be prioritising?
There's a few questions there.
Mm-hmm.
So very simply, yes, the church has a voice, most certainly. I think if you look at what the church has been about ever since the very beginning, it's about bringing that light of the gospel, the light of Christ, into the world in which we live at any particular moment. And there's a certain sense in which that task never changes. What changes is the circumstance. So the circumstance of this year, very different to the circumstance 10 years ago or even 2. So at every moment in our history, the community of the church, I'm not just thinking bishops and priests, but the whole community of the church needs to be attuned, if you like, and open to be able to bring that light into the situations that we face, whatever they may be. So thinking of the world currently, obviously, there's a massive issue of peace, the conflicts that we see around the world. How can we bring the light of Christ to that, or the call for the need for the most vulnerable, the poorest in our societies to have the security and the life that they need? That's just one example. But always it's, what are the situations right now? How can we bring that light into that situation? Not just to shine on it, as it were, from a distance, but it's a light that transforms. And then people start to think, there's another way to look at this. There's another way to think about this. And that way of thinking about it is informed by the gospel, I think.
I think that's very valid in terms of the international agenda. But in terms of the specific local agenda to Westminster, is there anything additional you could mention in terms of priorities?
Gosh, well, I mean, if I can speak just for a moment from a little bit of personal experience here. For the last 10 years or so, I've been the Bishop nationally for prisons. Now, we know that this country has the highest per capita prison population in Europe. And it's a population, by and large, that is not declining. Conditions of our prisons, in many cases, are very poor. So I ask myself, how do we bring the gospel into that situation? How can we encourage government sometimes? How can we encourage those who are working at the coalface, if you like, in our prison settings, to look at things in a new way? And I think one of the great things that has been looked at recently by government is the removal of the 6-month sentence, for instance. I wouldn't go so far as to suggest that that's down to the work that the Catholic community has done. But what we have had over the last few years is a succession of documents, the most recent one, Remember Me, that we issued last October, which does what we've been talking about. It brings the light of the gospel into that prison setting. And it's a third of a series where we've been reminding, if you like, those involved with legislation of the issues that have been present in prisons for a long while.
That's a really great priority. And there's a lot happening outside the church as well as in the church in regards to prisons. So I think it'd be really interesting to see where you can take that.
Well, just if we can stay with that theme for a moment, I chair the Plato Trust, I've done for a few years. The Plato Trust gives grants to organisations, projects, not simply Catholic ones, but projects coming from anywhere really that align with Catholic social teaching. And so one of the things that I do as a Plato trustee, all of us pick up the projects that we're doing and visit them, and I do the prisons ones. So I've been down to a project we've been supporting in Bristol, being run from an Anglican church, to a project being run out of an office near Leeds Prison by select prison officers, helping people into employment. So it's that Catholic social teaching light, if I can use that word again, being shone in all sorts of places, not necessarily specifically Catholic at all, but where it aligns, then we're there to support and help.
I'm staying with the local agenda just for a little bit. Is the abuse situation on your radar?
I think the abuse situation is on the radar of bishops generally, really. The tragedy of abuse has been a part of the history of the church. It's that's been seen very clearly in recent times. We are a church now that reports and works with statutory authorities at every step. And certainly, as a bishop, I'm always be ready to meet with those who are survivors and have done and always will do. And in a sense, it's part of our ministry now. So I think with regard to the whole issue of abuse, a dreadful experience. Imagine what it's like for those who've been the victims of abuse, and it's been a dreadful blight on the church. But the measures that we've got in place now are strong, and that real desire that one has to meet with those who have been the victims of abuse, all that's part of ministry now.
What kind of lessons have you drawn from your experience in Arundel and Brighton, particularly around synodality, for example?
Well, we've had the last, and I've been in Arundel and Brighton for 10 years. We started a little bit after I arrived, looking at how we could best do the church's mission, kind of going back to the theme we were talking about before, best doing the church's mission in the setting in which we found ourselves there. And that led, over a period of time, I did a lot of meetings around the diocese with lay faithful, with priests. I think it was 58 meetings altogether. And part of that, it was a 3-stage process. So I went out, I threw some ideas out, and I gave them a bit of time to think about them. And then I went back and I just sat and listened. That was stage 2. Then I went away and wrote something, and I went back and presented it. And that was all pre-COVID. Then post-COVID, I went round another twice, and we had another bit of listening and a bit more writing. And that led to the pastoral plan that we were just beginning to implement when the Holy Father asked me to come to Westminster. So in a way, although we weren't quite using the language in pre-COVID times, it was sort of synodal, because there was this thing of, okay, here's some ideas I've got. Now think about them. You tell me what you think, So that was quite interesting. And I think the result is that the pastoral plan, where it had got to just a few months ago, with the forming of new parishes, larger parishes, with priests working as teams, the reception of that was actually in the 2 parishes that we did inaugurate, I found extraordinary. The lay faithful saying, this is a new opportunity for the church. And I think it worked that way because we'd had all those conversations. And so for me, it was actually a pretty positive experience. So I think that business of conversation, one of the things that I think is important about the whole synodal way of doing things is it's about relationships. It's about having that conversation, that relationship with somebody. And that reflects something deeply theological, which is the relationship we have with Christ. So he calls us to relationship, and the whole thing becomes relational.
What logistical things might you do in Westminster in terms of taking that forward?
Well, I don't know Westminster yet at all. So my first task is to get to know people. So already into the diary, I've got, I think it's 7 masses across the 5 areas in the 2 weeks or so after the installation. So just to get around very quickly, they're not going to be in-depth conversations at that stage, but that will be the start of a series of conversations, building the relationship, and then we see what happens.
Father Richard, there's evidence that while mass attendance is overall in decline, at least in the West, there has been an increase in young adults, a bit like Aili, being received into the church from other denominations or from non-religious backgrounds. So what do you think should be the priorities of the church in its approach to mission in this context?
I'm just going to preface that with a thought. There has been talk of this quiet revival. And as I think I mentioned when I had a press conference before Christmas, it's quite early to see if that is kind of big revival. If we see this pattern continuing for 5 or 10 years, then you would say this is a revival, the grand scheme of things. But what we are experiencing is a resurgence of interest in faith, in the Catholic faith. We're seeing, and certainly I saw this in Arundel and Brighton, an increase in the number of people seeking baptism, or reception into full communion of the Catholic Church. It's certainly the case. And again, I think it's about invitation, it's about openness, it's about welcome. And thinking of places like Westminster Cathedral, it's open all day, people come in to pray, there's that natural flow of people in and out. It's a very comfortable place, it seems for people to be. And it's those kinds of things, and also then offering the opportunity for a more in-depth conversation. Again, in my own experience in parish life, we used to have in a parish I served in a late evening Saturday confession slot. It was mostly young people would come, and to be honest, they were coming for a longer conversation. And out of that then came a real engagement with faith. People started to think, what is the Lord calling me to do and to be in my life? And it was all there because that conversation was made possible. So I think that's the thing. It's about openness and providing the opportunity for the chat, the opportunity for times of.
So Cardinal Nichols has said that progress in ecumenism was one of the highlights of his time in office. What are your hopes for ecumenical and interfaith relations?
Well, I was blessed for the last few years in Arundel and Wright to be chair of Churches Together in Surrey, and had close relationships with the other Christian communities in particular. In Woking and in Surrey, where is actually the oldest Muslim community in the country. There, we had a lot of very good social action projects going on there with people of other faiths. As I've said, Westminster is new to me. I've got to get to know people, but I would certainly hope that those kinds of relationships are going to continue here, and we start to work together and see what becomes possible.
Ask about the horse.
Yeah.
I don't have a horse anymore. No, I had to have my horse put down many, many years ago now. I have been riding a little bit in Arundel and Wright, and maybe might do a little bit of riding in London at some point. We'll see. I used to ride in London when I was first ordained a priest every week. So we'll see. We'll see.
Ride around Hyde Park.
I used to ride around Hyde Park.
Well, if you're going out, let us know, because it's great pictures. Hopefully stable.
Yes, I hope so, yeah.
What kind of hat do you wear when you're riding? Just a normal riding hat. Do you want to ask about childhood and favourite saint?
Yeah.
Oh,
Do you have a favourite saint?
I have some favourite saints. I've been an oblate of St. Benedict of the monastery at Pluscaden in Scotland for nearly 50 years now. So Benedict and his rule actually are quite important in my own spiritual life. And part of, we talked earlier on about leadership and service. What's formed some of that reflection in my life actually is Benedict's rule. The way the abbot, for instance, looks at all the people in his community and says, how can I do the best for this one with his or her gifts and talents, or this person with their gifts and talents? So Benedict is quite big. I've known the Carthusian community in Sussex since I was a seminary student. So I have a devotion to Bruno. In fact, I was in retreat. They allowed me to do a retreat there just before I came here. And always, since I was about 12 or 13 to Resident Lisieux, has been a great favourite of mine. And I love her writing and her lovely images of doing the little things well and not trying to imagine you can do everything, but leaving things with the Lord. So those would be my big three.
And I was also going to ask, did you have any particular formative experiences of faith in your travel?
Well, I've often felt that my vocational journey is a bit dull, actually. I began to think, what would it like to be a priest? We had a wonderful parish priest, and I thought, what would it be like to do what he does? That's where it started. When I was about 12, the thought I went away, and I started going on retreat through when I was as a teenager. Applied for the seminary when I was 17, and left school in July and started formation in August. So it's been, in one way, rather straightforward. But it was the example of it, and I think this is so often the case with the vocational journey. It's the example of another is the first thing. And then one's own experience of prayer. I was very blessed to have some wonderful retreat times as a teenager. The experience of God in silence. Out of that, you realise, this is where I'm supposed to be. But no bright lights or angels flying in the window or anything like that. Really quite simple and straightforward.
Developing that a little further, the previous Pope, Francis, was very critical of something he describes as clericalism, and so were quite a few other people. So your journey, as you say, is very straightforward, but also it is an example of what some might be called clericalisation. So how would, because it's kind of straight from school into seminary and everything. I'm not being critical here, but I'm just saying, how would you answer people who criticise the church at the moment for its over-clericalisation?
I think clericalism, I agree completely with the Holy Father, of course, but clericalism is a dangerous thing. And again, it comes back to what we were saying right at the beginning, which is service. Because if we stay on that theme of service, we don't clericalize. Because in my that's maybe my reflection on it, because you're looking to the other. And if you look to the other, whoever that happens to be, you're not going to think, what's my position here? And that applies not just to clergy, because there will be those in the church who will say, well, depending on how you look at the way the lay faithful pick up roles of responsibility, there's a risk that they can clericalize because it's about the position I have. So it's all down to service. I think that's really is the answer here. So if you've got a priest who's focusing on service, a deacon, a head teacher, somebody working in their parish, somebody working wherever they are, how can I serve the gospel message here? You don't need to worry. The clericalism, the danger of that begins to disappear, because you're looking outwards, not inwards.
So this week's tablet, which is out in print on Saturday, but is going online today or tomorrow, Clifford Longley has written this feature describing, your appointment as a pivotal moment and the great potential for change. And in it, he asked a number of questions, such as, why be a Catholic? I don't know if you had a chance to see this feature yet.
A little brief look, not much more at this stage, I'll be honest.
Cliff says this is not a question that has yet been fully answered. So can you answer it? Why be a Catholic?
Why be a Catholic? I'm going to go back to that word relationship. It's about that awareness in one's life of the call that Christ gives to you, or to anybody, to that relationship with him. And that is, and I think I've used this word in the past, that is the most wonderful adventure. There will always be surprises along the way. There will always be new opportunities. Going back to that theme we were talking about earlier on, bringing the light of the gospel into all the situations we face is the most wonderful thing to be able to do. And I think the Catholic Church, the body of the teaching of the magisterium, it holds together. There is a wholeness about it, a completeness about it. Doesn't mean that it's easy always. Sometimes it can be very difficult, but there is a wholeness about it that makes the whole thing really, for me, very exciting.
I certainly agree. It is a potentially very exciting time, and I can't wait to see what you do with it. But Cliff does go on in his feature to talk about the church being essentially inward-looking and wondering, should this change? Is it changing anyway? And do you think that that's a problem?
I've always been very fond of history, so my favourite subject at school is history, and I just continue it. I often look at things from an historical perspective. I think it's really important for anybody in any position of authority to bear in mind the history, because if we don't look at the history, we don't learn any lessons, and we keep doing the same thing over and over again. If you look at the history of the Catholic Church, certainly in this country, we've come from a time of persecution, and that has marked us in some way, and that's bound to have happened. I think where we're at now is that there is an opportunity. I think there has been for a long time, and in many ways one sees it in smaller ways. I can think of loads of instances in my experience in priesthood where I've seen the church reaching out in the most impactful way, but not necessarily on the grand scale. I think that business of bringing the gospel into the very concrete is something that happens at the local level pretty much all the time. On the grander scale, perhaps we are becoming more confident. I think that probably is true. I think this is going to be helped by the kind of synodal listening that's going on. The conversations that we have within the church bring about a confidence that perhaps we haven't had in the past, and a real sort of renewed willingness, if you like, to step out there. We've spoken early on in the conversation about the prisons work, and I think that's one place where where we are as a church being impactful and working along with other churches too. I mean, if I think of another example, look at my years as Bishop of the Armed Forces, the presence of chaplains in those contexts, working ecumenically, we've always worked with brothers and sisters from other churches, was very impactful in the most difficult of circumstances. So we've got to keep that in view too. It's not just about Catholics doing things on their own, just sort of all on their own track.
Yeah.
We need to be open to accompany others and be accompanied by them. So I think there is a renewed confidence. I would agree that we're coming from a place historically that has maybe been a bit inward looking in some respects. Just to give you one more example, perhaps. For some years, I was chaplain in a girls' school in South London, a Catholic school, 20% roughly Catholic students. So that was certainly the church looking after a school, being responsible for a school, welcoming others, reaching out to them, all the social needs of the families that we were in contact with. It wasn't about saying, because you come to the school, you're going to become a Catholic, but rather the church being in a place where we could reach out to young people in their need and to their families. So that's, that smaller level, good things going all the way through the piece. But I would agree on the grand scale that perhaps we are becoming and will continue to become more confident.
Yes, and on that theme then, I mean, there's many people, including myself, who really believe that with the current state of the world and what's happening in the wider secular world, the voice of the church is needed now as much as it's ever been, which opens up the possibility of a stronger role for someone such as yourself in terms of advocacy and lobbying in the secular sphere. Is that something you see yourself wanting to do? Or?
I have a little experience of this again, coming back to the prisons thing. So for the last several years now, I've had meetings with prisons ministers in and out of HMBDPS headquarters, conversations in there, meeting relatively recently with the Chief Inspector of Prisons. Now, that's just one sphere, obviously, but that's where I've had a particular engagement in recent years. But I think that's an indication that I'm happy to have those conversations.
Great. Now, I've just got one last question, then I'll see if Aila's got anything she wishes to add. Will you become president of the Bishops' Conference?
Well, there is going to be an elective process at the Low Week meeting.
Yeah, of course.
Let's see what happens.
But it's not something you're set against. Excellent.
I guess my last question would be, you said that you're unpacking lots of books.
Yeah.
And what are the most important books for you? What would you take to a desert island?
Well, am I still allowed the scriptures and the works of Shakespeare?
Yes.
If I was going to take one book to a desert island, would be, I think it's only a little book. It's a little book called The Prayer of Love and Silence, written by a Carthusian monk. That would be my other takeaway. Oh gosh, I'd have to have the Rule of St. Benedict. Am I allowed that as well?
Yes. Wonderful.
Thank you very much, Archbishop.
Thank you.
And really great to talk to you.
Thanks for being with us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great.